Welcome to Murder Most Foul, a podcast devoted to exploring famous murder cases of our time. Some solved, some unsolved, but all fascinating and guaranteed to raise the hairs on the back of your neck. I'm your host, Jim Solanowski. Today's episode: In Broad Daylight. On July 10th, 1981, Ken Rex McElroy was shot to death on the main street of Skidmore, Missouri. 45 townspeople watched. His wife, sitting next to him in the truck, identified the gunman. In spite of 3 grand jury investigations and an FBI probe, no indictments were ever issued, no trial held, and the town of Skidmore has protected the killer with silence ever since. In Broad Daylight, A Murder in Skidmore, Missouri, is an Edgar Allan Poe True Crime Award winner written by Harry N. MacLean. This riveting contemporaneous book takes us inside the minds and souls of the townspeople of this small midwestern town as they grapple with a monster in their midst. Join me as I sit down and chat with Harry N. MacLean. So let's start with your background and your coming to this case. And again, it is an older case. We'll get into the dates, but this book was written in the 80s and still has an impact today in the town of Skidmore and its environs. So tell us how you came by it.
Well, I'm a lawyer, and I was practicing law in Denver, and I'd always wanted to be a writer. And one day I saw I think it was a little Newsweek clip, and it had a picture of a guy holding a little girl on his lap and looking directly into the camera. And the headline said, "Vigilante Killing in Missouri Town." And it wasn't much of an article. It was one they had outlined in red, but the essence of it was that the town had taken the law into its own hands and killed Ken McElroy, who had supposedly terrorized actually all of northwest Missouri. And they were on the look for the killers. And I was interested in it. I always wanted to write a book. And I'm from Nebraska, so I thought, well, that's just right across the river from where I grew up. I'm going to keep an eye on this. And then I saw that they had convened a federal grand jury in Kansas City to solve the murder, and they brought all the townspeople down there. And it was pretty obvious by then that there had been a lot of witnesses. Every account of it said there were anywhere between 20 and 50 people who witnessed the shooting and the death of Ken McElroy. So I've run a federal grand jury before, and they're pretty intimidating instruments to the law. And I told myself, if that grand jury disbands and does not indict anybody, I'm going to write a book on this case. Because then it reached the level of being extraordinary. I mean, his wife was sitting right next to him when he was shot, and she turned around and saw the shooter. So you had eyewitness testimony. And sure enough, I kind of forgot about it. And one day, about 6 or 7 months later, there's a little clip down there that says, "Grand jury in McElroy case disbands, no indictment." So I thought, well, you told yourself you were going to do it. So now get in your car and head out to Missouri and see what you can do.
One of the things that struck me, and again, I'm from the East, born and bred in the East. Upstate New York was where I was born, and I haven't gone west of the Mississippi except to travel and to visit. But I read enough, I know enough about small towns. I mean, we see movies, television programs about small towns. But the things about Skidmore and the area that did surprise me, because the Missouri, the kind of And again, this is not meaning to put anything down or demeaning, but the guns, the pickup trucks, the Friday nights at the bar, the fights, all that kind of stuff, the farms, I guess. It struck me, well, it sounds like Texas, or it sounds like Alabama or Mississippi, young girls, 13, 14 years old, getting pregnant. I guess I thought Missouri was more Little House on the Prairie, kind of, not as again, it's a bad word, but dysfunctional, that I think bred him, this is in my uneducated opinion, bred him and bred the response. Am I oversimplifying?
No, well, I think one thing that's important to keep in mind is that Missouri was a slaveholding state. It did not join the Confederacy, but it was sympathetic to the Confederacy. And of course, you had some of the greatest outlaws in the West come out of Missouri after the end of the Civil War. So there is that kind of independent Southern, we don't like a lot of law in our town, we'll take care of our own problems attitude. And there was not a strong city government, town government. There was not a strong county government. People kind of, kept to themselves and took care of their own problems. And it was kind of the price that they paid for it, because a lot of other communities would have dealt with McElroy other ways. But, this kind of iconoclastic way. And there were also, these towns were really isolated. It was only 18 miles from Maryville, Skidmore was, but it was a long 18 miles. And the back roads of Missouri, northwest Missouri, a lot of them weren't numbered. They didn't have letters. They didn't have names. They didn't have numbers. They just kind of roamed around out there. And that's the way people liked it.
Now, to give us a taste of the town, what was the population? I know you said it spreads out and, you can't really enclose it because of farms and that, but give or take, what would they say their population was at the time?
Actual town in 1981, which is when he was shot to death, was about 450 people. There was a time, once again, it was when the railroad went through around the turn of the century, that it was up around 4,000 or 5,000 people, had hotels and opera houses and restaurants and all that. And then as the railroads died away and Maryville, the county seat, got Walmart and so forth, these little towns struggled even more and lost population and so forth. And so it was, but it was all kind of by itself. You didn't go to Skidmore unless you were going to Skidmore. It wasn't really on the way to anywhere. And you had a feeling of isolation when you drove in there. It was a very kind of telling feeling when you got there. I don't know if it would have happened in a larger town or a town closer to a big city. It was kind of all by itself out in the woods.
Now, also, it was mostly farming. I believe was hog farming was a big part of the area.
Yeah, well, it was. They didn't do much cattle, but they did do a lot of hogs and a lot of crops. There was soybeans, corn were the big ones. They had some oil and so forth, but it was great farmland. It was very rich in soil, and they had enough water that they had enough rain that they didn't have to irrigate, and so it was just a natural cycle. And it was very, very productive land. And the farms there, like the farm I ended up living with, the farm family there when I got the story, they were fourth generation farmers, same land. So you had that kind of feel to it. Everybody there had been there a couple of generations, most of them, and they knew each other and they knew each other's family.
Now, again, you narrate very beautifully and color the area. So really, from reading the book, you can get a very taste of it. Like you said, small town. They had the pumpkin festival, and I'm sure holidays were big. So being that small, and there probably was one or maybe two churches, and so it was a community. So when this incident came to be, you can almost see how it was able to, or why it ended the way it did, because it was so small and tight knit. Let's Let's talk a little bit now. Let's start talking about the person who was killed, who is the murder in Skidmore, Missouri, Ken Rex McElroy. So, without going all the way back to his childhood, but talking about his relationships, I know he had a couple of women, and that. So maybe like sort of his arrival might be a good way to get there. Maybe a little bit before that, his arrival in the area.
Yeah, his family was one of the few around there that wasn't generational. His family came from Kansas, and he was one of 14 children. He was the 13th. And they were on the outside of town. They were not particularly successful farmers. They were kind of at the bottom of the economic scale, which has been given as an excuse, and I think rightfully so. He was resentful of wealthier farmers and people he thought were looking down on him, and that kind of set up this paranoid pathology that he had. But he wasn't, I don't think he was literate. I think he could sign his name, and that was about it. But he was a very cunning reader of human personalities and weaknesses in the system. So he was a bully. He was a bully from 6th or 7th grade on. It didn't get particularly serious. I mean, he would take knives on the bus and threaten people and so forth. But it didn't get particularly serious until he got 17 or 18 and started really hunting younger girls and making it clear to everybody that, including his family members and the law and the town, that the law didn't really apply to him. And he rode his horse where he wanted to, and kind of was his own person, you know. And
as he, I could say, he kept a sort of stayed on one key, but things did, during the time, things escalated, and he will cover a couple of things. He threatened people with, and the big thing then, of course, was not handguns. I mean, I'm sure they had them, but it was shotguns and rifles, which is, an interesting, especially a shotgun. Interesting, you can't do ballistics on a shotgun. But, and so it's also a threatening thing. You can hit someone with it. You can just point it at them. And we'll talk about the case that, got him sort of close to being in trouble with the shopkeeper. But you did mention women, so that, again, as I counted, he was at least married or involved with Sharon, Alice, and Trina. Why don't you give us a little background on each of the three and maybe, progeny that came from them?
Well, I mean, those were women that he married or lived with. There were, I counted once, over 30 women that had had children by him. And just to make it clear, he roamed all over a 13-county area of northwest Missouri. He lived outside of Skidmore and terrorized them the worst. But he had that whole corner of Missouri under his thumb by the time he was shot, including lawmen who were scared to go up against him. But he always had a gun. He always had a rifle or a shotgun in his truck. But so did most of, well, there's farmers and there's ranchers. The farmers tended to wear seed dealer hats and overalls. The ranching types wore cowboy hats, and they tended to always have a weapon in their pickup. Now, a lot of the farmers did too, but it was real common. And he was able to terrorize people just by looking at him by the time he went down. But the women were allies of his, and he would take stolen hogs or cattle or chemicals and hide them on their farms until things cooled down. And then they would take them to auction and sell them. And they also had children by him. And almost every time I've gone back, if I've gone around to some of these other towns, somebody will come up to me and say, Kenny was my dad, Well, who was your mom? Well, it would be some name I never heard of before. So he was very active that way. Now, the women that he focused on were almost always younger. The one you mentioned earlier was 12. He first was sleeping with her mother and then sleeping with her. And she was the one who ended up running with him in the end and was sitting next to him when he was shot. But they were usually younger and pretty, but they were from the lower economic scale. They didn't come from strong families. He could sense weakness, and he could sense who he could terrorize and who he couldn't. Like this one, Trina, that we're talking about, who just died recently. Her parents gave up. They wouldn't stand up to McElroy. He burned their house down and they fled to Arkansas. So then he had her all to himself. And when he died, he had Alice Wood and Trina living out there with him with about 13 or 14 kids. But I mean, he was still active with other women all over Northwest Missouri.
Now, was he married to either one of them, Alice or Trina, or married to one and being with the other? What, with Alice and Trina, what was the legality, if there was such a thing?
Well, I'll go back a little bit. He was, at one point, he was prosecuted for rape and child abuse and so forth because Trina was only 12 and 13. And he'd get off the school bus and take her to a motel in St. Joe, so forth. So they finally got a DA who would stand up to him and prosecuted him. He was married to Sharon at that point. So he went to his Kansas City lawyer, who becomes quite a character in the story, and said it's true that that a wife can't testify against her husband. Yeah, that's true. So he divorced Sharon and forced Trina's parents into agreeing to her marrying him. So all 13 cases that had been brought against him were dismissed by the DA because without Trina, there wasn't any case. So to answer your question, he was married to her at the time of his death, but that's how it came about.
Now, as I say, it's page by page by page. So we're doing good and hitting some highlights, but I do recommend people pick up the book in broad daylight because each page I turned and each chapter, and the chapters are short, so you can get a place where you go, okay, I'll pick this up tomorrow, which I did. My wife kept saying, "What are you reading tonight?" and she calls it my murder hobby, of course. So I would tell her what the case is, and so we both had our little book light. She reads romantic novels, and I read this. But after a while, after several chapters, you realize, okay, it's not bluster. I mean, he backed up bluster with actions so that when you then got hit by a bluster, you better take it seriously. Yeah. And one of the things I want to read for my listeners, which was probably the most shocking. I mean, I've heard other things, bad people say things, but this is on page 157 of the book, and it was his face-to-face with the priest, not priest, but preacher, one of the reverends of the, forget what his name is, it Warren or Wilson?
Tim Warren.
Warren. Okay, so he had an issue that Ken felt someone was getting into his face. And so he says to this preacher, if you keep on minding other people's business instead of your own, we're going to rape your wife in front of you, and then we're going to cut your little boy's sex organs off and make him eat them while you watch. We're going to tie you up and cut him into little pieces, and then all of us are going to fuck your wife in front of you, and then we're going to kill you. Now, I don't even know how you come up with that. I mean, I've been mad at people, but how you come up with that very specific and picturesque threat, and yet never carried out. But the people had to believe he's capable of that.
Yeah, I mean, he followed through just enough that he had a lot of credibility, and you didn't know whether he was fooling with you or whether he was actually going to do it, because it wasn't always rational. He would get hung up on something, and in that case, Tim Warren was the minister, and he was giving solace to another victim the grocer, he was stopping by, who McElroy had shot and tried to kill, and he was just stopping by the grocer's house to see how he was doing. Well, McElroy spotted that. Then you're his enemy too. So that's why he stopped by Warren's house. So you could cross him and not even know it. And in fact, what led to the whole thing was his daughter, who also just died recently, going into a grocery store in Skidmore, and the woman who owned the store accused her, well, according to McElroy, accused her of stealing a jawbreaker. She said no. Trina and the girl went in, and Trina said that all she did was take it up and pick it up and kind of walk out. She wasn't stealing it. But anyway, that got back to McElroy, that his child had been accused of shoplifting, and that's what set the whole chain of events off, and for about the next 2 years, which resulted in him being shot. So it was real. People just stayed out of his way. It was easier just to stay out of his way. I mean, I still get emails and phone calls from people about McElroy, and I had one the other day. The guy was probably about 65, and he was growing up. He was a boy when McElroy was running, and he heard a racket outside the house in the hog pen one night, and he saw McElroy, and he comes in, tells his dad. Dad says, Dad, Ken McElroy's out there stealing hogs. And he says, how many has he got? He said, he's only got 2. And he said, hell, let him go. It's not worth it.
So that's the other part of this. I mean, again, we can have the bully part and a nasty neighbor, etc. Everyone's had, nasty neighbor things, and sometimes they escalate. But this guy was also a thief. I mean, he's stealing hogs, which these people aren't rich people, and you invest, feed, and whatever, and care in a hog to sell it, and he's just taking them. And I gotta laugh or chuckle that he's upset that his daughter's being accused, rightfully or wrongfully, of being a shoplifter, and he's stealing hogs. Yeah. So
He never had an occupation. He wasn't a farmer, and he didn't raise these hogs. He sold them at auction. But he was smart in a way. He also stole chemicals, which are extremely valuable. Can be. He would find out when farmers were gone and go in and steal their antiques, and he had a network of people in Northwest Missouri selling them for him.
Was that you said, that sometimes people didn't know why they crossed him. There were people that, men usually, who would be with him and clearly feel threatened, and they're simply, what did I do? Whatever it is, I'm sorry. I don't remember what I did, and it never was clear why that particular person, that particular moment, somebody knew, not, even not a friend maybe, but an acquaintance in the town, he would all of a sudden it was clear to the person at least that they felt threatened.
Yeah, well, I mean, the best example of that is Romaine Henry. Romaine Henry was a farmer in the area, and McElroy caught him out on the street, on the road, one day, and pulled a shotgun out and went over to his truck. He stopped him and shot him, stuck the shotgun in his stomach and pulled the trigger and shot him. And Romaine ended up surviving this, but he never understood what was going on. Now, there were other people who had theories that they were both sleeping with the same woman and so forth, but Romaine claimed up and down that he had no idea what he had done to cross McElroy. I tell you, that's where the townspeople got really scared, because they prosecuted McElroy for, it was an assault with attempt to kill. It wasn't attempted murder, but it was an assault charge. And Romaine Henry came in and testified, said, yeah, Ken McElroy came up, stuck the shotgun in my stomach and pulled the trigger. And yet he was acquitted by the jury. And so this led the people to believe, they were convinced then, that he was going to get away with whatever he did, because the law never handled him. They never got him convicted, or if he did get convicted, all of a sudden the case was dropped and no one ever heard of it again. So,
Now,
and I remember Romaine Henry saying to me, how can someone not know who stuck a shotgun in his stomach and pulled the trigger?
What was interesting about it, and again, the trial, not day to day, but it is covered in the book. And I think at first I said, come on, each time these come up, I go, okay, bang, slam dunk, unless there's prosecutorial, corruption, which there wasn't in any of these cases where he was tried for things, even in the final case. But that there's one witness, the victim. And the victim, not only my assailant was 6 foot tall. I mean, he knew who he was. It's like, I know who Ken McElroy is. We talked. It wasn't like he came up behind me. I think it was him. And yet there's no one else. But wow, I mean, we think of these O.J. Simpson, all these weird cases with incredible, circumstantial evidence, but no eyewitness, everything, and some of them are convicted, some are not. But in this case, just to leave. And yet, I guess, or maybe I ask you this question, did you get to interview, not necessarily maybe the jurors, but anyone about the trial? Was there any indication that they acquitted him because they were afraid?
Oh, yeah. No, I talked to 2 jurors. It wasn't in the Romaine Henry case. It was in the eventual case. But I'm sorry. One of them was Romaine Henry, and he had other people talk to them. Friends of his. He always found somebody who knew each one of them, and they would go talk to him and say, things aren't good. Bad things are going to happen if he gets convicted. He also did things like put rattlesnakes in their mailboxes and so forth. So, and one juror just in the Romaine Henry case said to me, it wasn't worth it. I knew he could find out who I was, and he tracked me down. And, I got a 10-year-old daughter. Maybe he'd get her too. So no way he was going to be convicted.
And in fact, there was a judge even, I think maybe it was in the later case, or there's so many, or a civil case or whatever. I think his name might have been Wilson, but he said he recused himself because he said in another situation he had been threatened by McElroy, and he took it seriously. And he said, I don't know if he was doing it because he was afraid or more that it might come out that he was threatened. So he didn't want someone to say that he was acquitting or giving favorable treatment. But the bottom line was he terrorized a judge.
Terrorized a judge, and he burned his barn down. And that's when he ended up recusing himself. Now, everybody assumed it was McElroy who burned his barn down. Wilson sure assumed it, and he was scared of him. He just didn't want anything to do with him. And the prosecutor that was going to handle the eventual case ended up resigning and going into the military and going into JAG, and they couldn't get anybody else to be the prosecutor. No one wanted to do it, and finally they found this young legal aid lawyer a year out of law school who took the job and got the conviction.
This is a bit random, but because you're a lawyer, you could probably answer this for me. Is there anywhere, when, or why that this anyone sniffed around federally about any of this?
Well, the people made, the people in the town contacted the governor, contacted the attorney general, contacted their state representatives, and so forth. But it was always local. It wasn't one of those enumerated crimes, which will bring the FBI in. Although they did. Now, McElroy's lawyer claimed that the town marshal and the mayor conspired to kill McElroy. Well, people acting under color of law, like policemen, if they commit a crime, that is a federal crime. So they did have a federal investigation after his shooting. And of course, the people go, well, where in the hell were you when he was terrorizing us now, So Romaine survived. And then that brings us to, now we're getting to the actual case at the end of the situation, which involves the shopkeeper. So let's go. Well, every time something like this happens, he gets a little more twisted and a little bit more paranoid about it. And he's getting a little bit older now. He's 48, 49 years old. And he's starting to focus now more on Skidmore. It used to be he roamed anywhere, all over, and would, commit his crimes and terrorize people. He started to get into it with Skidmore and started doing things to get them more frightened, more terrorized, and more convinced that nobody was ever going to help him out. And then the incident happened where Trina and one of the daughters went in, another one stayed out in a pickup. And Mrs. Bowenkamp owned the grocery store, and she was a very harsh woman, shall we put it that way. Curmudgeonly, just didn't put up with anything. And she saw the little girl pick up the candy, and Trina said, "Put the candy back." Well, the little girl put it back and then picked it up again and walked out with it. And you just anybody else would have let her go, and even probably given her some more candy just to get her out of there. But not Mrs. Bowenkamp. She goes there, she says, "Hey, your daughter, she's got that candy there. She's got it in her pocket." So Trina took the candy away, threw it down on the table there, and went out. Well, then they go back and tell McElroy what's happened. McElroy and Trina then come back into the store, and he's waving a knife around and so forth, and wants Trina and Mrs. Bowenkamp to go out into the street and have a fight and get bets going on it and so forth. Well, that started the reign of terror on the Bowenkamps and any friend of the Bowenkamps, their neighbors, relatives. McElroy stayed on them. He drove by their house, 3 o'clock in the morning, fired off shotguns in the air. He'd just follow him. On the street, he'd have his kids follow him. There'd be phone calls. And finally, he goes into the grocery store. He goes into the back of the grocery store where Mrs. Bowenkamp's husband, Bo, is working. He's the butcher. And he's the back of the store. He's cutting up cardboard boxes. McElroy sees 3 young boys right there in the alleyway and gives them $2 or $3 to go inside the tavern. He then pulls out his shotgun, walks up to the grocer and has some words with him. There's a little dispute as what was said, and then shoots him. And he's probably 15 feet away from at the point, and the grocer just happens to move at the right moment, or else it was aimed right at his head and his neck. Tears off the right side of his neck, he falls down, and he survives too. And old Bo was a tough old guy. He stuck in there. He hung in there, and he went to the hearings, and he testified. And they were all, McElroy rounded up all these phony witnesses like he always did. But he got convicted, and he was going to go to jail. The town didn't believe it. They didn't think it was ever going to happen, but they were kind of coalesced around the fact that they had finally stood up to McElroy. So
now, before we go forward, I wanted to I can slip this in if it's a little earlier, even on an earlier case. There's 2 things that I found very chilling. One is McElroy in the bar telling the witness, I'll shoot you or you cannot testify. Was that Bo or someone else on an earlier case?
No, what happened was when he was convicted, the judge said, well, first of all, the judge turned him loose, which was stupid. Now he's aggravated. And he put a rule on him that he couldn't carry any weapons. So that's like telling McElroy he can't breathe. So, of course, he goes into town with weapons. And he's spotted by 3 people. And they call up the DA and says he's walking around here with guns now. He's going to shoot somebody again. And the DA says, okay, I'm going to have a bond revocation. We're going to revoke his bond because he's carrying weapons. Well, then these 3 people have targets on their back, and they know it. They've stood up to him, but in the past, he shot people who stood up to him. And he's on the way to jail now. He is scared of going to jail, actually. And so they're terrified of him. And he does confront one of the witnesses in a bar one day. He was a guy he was an old World War II veteran, kind of a tough guy. And he was the one who convinced the other ones to actually sign these affidavits as to what they'd seen. And he has a incident with him where he threatens him in the bar. And Pete Ward goes back home and gets his rifle and stands up at the top of the street and says, if he turns this way when it comes out, I'm going to shoot him. And I think he probably would have, but McElroy turned the other way and went on. So you want me to tell what happens next?
Yes.
Okay. So they've got 10 days to survive, the town and these people, before McElroy's revocation hearing. They do. He's seen in streets, he's seen in alleys with guns and so forth behind these people's houses. And a lot of it's just to scare him, and he does. And they're absolutely terrified for those 10 days, particularly the family of these three witnesses. So finally comes the day they're going to have the bond revocation hearing. And they say, let's get organized. Let's do something here, because these three guys had got to drive 28 miles to the town where the trial was held and where the revocation will be held. They might not make it. And plus, we want to show McElroy that we're standing together now, that he can't pick us off one by one, which is what he's always done in the past. So they get organized that night. They're going to meet, they're going to get together down at the tavern in the morning with these three, and they're going to put a big cavalcade of cars. They're going to stick the three of them in the middle of it. They're going to get them up to this town. Well, that morning comes a phone call from, the next morning comes a phone call from the DA. He says, we've continued the case for a week. And the people go, and this is what, this is what sets it in action. They go, okay, look, we got to hang together here now. Let's stay organized. And they went up to the Legion Hall and they had a meeting. Now there's like 60 of them in there, all men. And there's a great debate about what went on in there. But the result of it, well, I've had several people tell me what did go on in there. But the result of it was somebody in there went to McElroy's farm and said they're having a meeting about what they're going to do with you. So you do that to Ken McElroy, you're asking for it. So he gets his wife, no weapons. He's a little smarter this time, goes into town. Then somebody tells the people in the Legion Hall, McElroy's come to town. So they know at this point they either stand up to him and deal with him, or it's all over for him. If he wins this round, if 60 of them get in their cars and drive away because he's come into town, it would be a total disaster. So they march down the street, and they go in. About 2/3 of them go in the tavern, and 1/3 of them stay outside up the hill from his truck. A couple of them are at the top of the hill with perfect views of what happens. He's in there with his wife. They have a beer. The guys start saying stuff to him they would never have said before, like, you need to get on out of here. We don't want you around anymore, and so forth. So Trina finally says, let's get out of here, Ken. So they do. They get a 6-pack of beer and go out, get in the truck. She sees the people in the street, and she has an inkling of what's going to happen. And she's been very clear in every time she told the story to the police, to the FBI, to me, about what happened. She gets in the car. Ken gets in the car. Ken's driving. She senses it. He starts the engine. It's a big old Chevy Silverado, and starts to light a cigarette. She looks around over her shoulder and sees Del Clement pull a .30-30 out of his pickup and cock it. And she yells at Ken, they're going to shoot you. And he didn't do anything. He doesn't back up. He doesn't duck down. He continues to light his cigarette as if like, I don't think you guys can, do it. And sure enough, in my view, as Del Clement, fires the 30-30. Someone else picks up a 22 and fires that, and Ken's head's pretty much blown to pieces by then. A lot of it flies on his wife too, as well. Pieces of his head and his teeth and so forth. And he's dead. And she is convinced they're going to kill her too, because she has been riding with him for the last 4 or 5 years. And somebody pulls her out of the truck and takes her up to the bank. Well, to shorten it a little bit, he sits there for about an hour and 20 minutes in his truck. Nobody calls the police. Nobody calls an ambulance. Finally, Trina goes back out to the ranch and tells his brother, and his brother calls the police. So it's about an hour and a half after the shooting, the law finally comes out there. And there is sitting there. One of the more dramatic things that happens is when he gets hit, he falls forward and his head hits the steering wheel and his foot presses down on the accelerator and stays like that. So you've got this terrible howling sound going on while he's bleeding to death. And pretty soon the truck starts to drop all sorts of fuel and oil and so forth. And it's a really weird situation, and people are kind of watching it like, is he really dead? They didn't believe it. I mean, they would actually go up and look in there and make sure that he was dead, or they drive by and actually had to convince themselves through their own eyes that he was dead. It wasn't good enough to hear somebody say, no, I saw the top of his head come off. They had to see him dead. And that's kind of where it stood.
And of course, as you state, it's broad daylight, as in the title of the book, In Broad Daylight, a murder in Skidmore, Missouri. And there certainly the men involved are all witnesses and participants, and other townspeople, I'm sure, were close by if they didn't see the instant when after the shot happened, and they're walking around. I mean, they are witnesses after the fact, and sort of because of the silence, almost, I don't want to count it like the mafia, but because they are all involved, and probably most of them felt there's nothing else we could do. There was no quote unquote witnesses, were there?
No, I mean, everybody knew who was out there, and the local cops formed kind of a committee from the state patrol, sheriff, marshals, and they went and talked to every one of these people. They found them. They found them out on their tractors. They found them at home. They found them in church, and every one of them said, "Well, I heard the first shot, and I jumped down between the trucks, or I ran between the buildings. So by the time I looked up, there wasn't anybody there anymore." And nobody said. Now, Trina always said who the killers were. And they got to one other person, Frankie Aldrich, who admitted under pressure that, in fact, it was Del Clement. Well, Del Clement's lawyer came to see him that night, and the next morning he had forgotten that he had actually seen the killing. So it just kind of went on like that, and everybody started, and then the FBI came into it. And that's to go back to me, that's what got me, because if you send these FBI agents into against those farmers and they can't crack them, then you really got a story, because these guys at most have high school educations, and those agents know all sorts of techniques to get them to talk, and they couldn't bust one of them out of 45 to 50 witnesses. It was absolutely amazing when you realize that how silent that. And the other part of the silence was, I don't think they ever talked about the killing amongst themselves. They didn't have to. They went home. I don't even think they told their wife or their kids what they saw, most of them. And they just got back on their tractors and they started harvesting their corn, I'm sure some of them did talk about it when they drank and so forth, but there was no conspiracy where they all got together and said, don't say anything. Here's what we want you to say.
And of course, this got a lot of national press coverage because of the, explosiveness of it, the vigilantism of it. And so I think there was a 60 Minutes and probably other interviews, print interviews that were given. So, it got its time in the sun.
I was also made a movie from my book called In Broad Daylight. And Brian Dennehy, the actor who died a year or so ago, played McElroy. Marcia Gay Harding, who got a Best Actress award for playing Pollock's wife, was Trina. Cloris Leachman, who just died, played the grocer's wife, who got into it with McElroy. And Chris Cooper played the only cop in Northwest Missouri who would stand up to McElroy and who captured him after he shot the grocer. You can actually see it on YouTube. It was a good movie. I've got a little solo part in it.
Now, as you mentioned at the top of this, that there was a grand jury, and they always say grand jury can, or a DA can indict a ham sandwich. But the outcome of this grand jury, which wasn't even in Missouri, it was in Kansas, right?
It was Kansas City, Missouri.
Kansas City. So it was out of the local area, taken a little bit further, and there was no true bill, correct?
Right. I mean, they, the first, I was convinced that the prosecutor in Maryville wanted to. He was the one who convicted McElroy of shooting the grocer, and I think he wanted to charge Del Clement with the killing. And he had Trina testify in front of the grand jury, and they just didn't believe her. Well, didn't believe her? I think they believed her. I think they knew who Ken McElroy was and said, are you serious? You really want us to put his killer in jail after his 30, 40-year reign of terror? I just think they just didn't want to do it. But the grand jury in Kansas City didn't know all this stuff. So that's a completely different story. It's been kind of a mystery. If you tamper with federal grand jury members, you can get in serious trouble. So I kind of left that alone. Now, because this is not a book that you wrote from distance. A lot of books are written long after a fact of something, Ted Bundy or John Wayne Gacy, written by people who do research, but you actually went down a few years or a year, 2 years after the murder? I went down about 9 or 10 months afterwards.
It was fresh.
It was fresh. And I was really fortunate. I'll make it real brief, but I ended up becoming close friends with members of a leading family in town. They had 5 sons. And it's a long story how it happened, but I ended up pretty much being accepted into that family. And I had my own room and, my own place where my car was parked, place at the table. And they all supported my effort. Without that, I don't think I ever would have done it, because that town was wound up tight as a drum. They weren't talking to anybody. And gradually, I lived there for 3 years. Gradually, I became a part of the town. And I was going to the pumpkin show. I was judging dance contests. I was selling tickets to the Mother's Day Bazaar. I was one of the people there.
Now did you say you actually got to speak to Trina as well?
Yeah, I spoke to Trina. By this time, she had recovered. He got her when she was 12, and she was about 22 then. And she sounded like a 12-year-old. It sounded like she got stuck in that age. But she had hooked up she was down in the Ozarks, and she'd hooked up with a really nice guy. He was there for the interview, and they had gotten married, and she was making a second run at life, and she made it. She had 2 or 3 kids with this guy, straightened out. I kind of left her alone after that interview, because I thought, give her a shot, and she did. She led a pretty good life. And she died also about 2 or 3 years ago from cancer, but I felt like she eventually outgrew that trauma of her childhood.
Now, you have pictures in the book, which is always great, because these people just become images in your head, and it's interesting to see him and other people talked about. Talk a little bit about the after for Alice. Did you get to interview her at all?
Well, I spent hours with Alice and her kids, and she was very explicit about McElroy's activities and him beating her pretty badly and coercing her, and then finally ending up with Trina, but demanding that she stay with them, with the kids and so forth. He was extremely brutal to all these women, including his kids. The kids stuck by him, but it was almost like they had to. Later I found out that some of his daughters were abused by him as well. Alice, it was funny. I don't think she knew what was exactly what she was saying. She was very detailed about what he did to her. And we all went on Oprah. They showed the movie to the Oprah audience, and then we came out, and it was myself and Alice and McElroy's lawyer and a couple of his kids. And she looked at me, and she was extremely upset over the book, I could tell, and the details that were in there. I think she felt like I had misled her or something, but I didn't. I taped everything. I think she didn't realize the story she was telling and the impact it was going to have on her kids. So it was a kind of a tense moment with her. She was a very nice, kind of sweet woman in a way. She wasn't a drunk. She didn't abuse her kids. She just got hooked up with this guy who would never let her go.
Now, as I told you, I think before we started taping, that one of the things that I was intrigued by this book, of all the mass murders or even individual murders I've covered, you pretty much, there's very few that you have sympathy for. You don't go, when the cops catch up with them and they either go to jail or are executed, it's a closure and it makes sense. I'm still processing this book. I've read it twice now, and I'm still processing it. What, after you, obviously so much more involved, like I'm not sure I knew about maybe I missed it I might have, sometimes I skip the prologue or the beginning parts. I'm not sure I knew about how engrossed or into the story you were in 3 years and down there. So what is your takeaway?
I went in neutral. And what I did tell the people there was, I will tell your side of the story. See, he'd gotten away with all these cases and so forth, and they knew it, but they couldn't prove it. They couldn't go into the files and demonstrate it. And I said, I will look at every brush he's ever had with the law, and we'll see where it gets us, I'm not out to name the killer, and I didn't name the killers. So I was very sympathetic to them in the end because of their well-founded belief that the law was not going to protect them from this guy, that he was running wild and he could shoot and kill at will. And nothing would happen to him. And they didn't make this stuff up, They didn't exaggerate it. It happened. And the town kind of dissembled in the face of it. They kind of they didn't turn on each other, but it was like the preacher. If he terrorized someone and you went to help that person, then you were next. And so the town was in pretty bad shape when it happened, and they're still in pretty bad shape now. But let me just say something about the book itself. As I traveled and talked about the book, one of the topics that seemed to be as much interest was how I got the story, because they were so tight. And what I told you was part of it. And so I wrote a follow-up book, about 120 pages, called The Story Behind In Broad Daylight, which told the whole story of a lot of what we've been talking about, and I finally named the killer in there and so forth. That is included, along with updates, a 25-year update, in a version of the book now that's out. I got the rights back from HarperCollins, and that's on Amazon. And it's got a blue and green cover, and on it says, included in this book is the story behind In Broad Daylight. So that will tell you this. The book and the second book is also in there.
What's the title of is it the same title?
Yeah.
Same title, but it has a different cover and has other things.
It's the same book and same title, but it's
got more stuff.
It's got more stuff. It's got the updates and then this version of how I got the story, because there's a lot of, there's paperback versions and the version you have, but the one that's just got all the pictures in it and everything.
Like I said, when we wrap up, we'll point them to all this, point my listeners to all this stuff. But the book, like I said, it really grabbed me when I knew what it was, but we started, with the brief part of the murder. In other words, a condensed version. And then I said, well, this isn't very satisfying as far as information. Then it went further, and then, we get much more at the end. So did you approach it that way?
I had a terrible fight with my editor over that.
No.
He just said, you can't, that's the end of the story.
No.
And I said, everybody knows what happened to him. They know he was shot to death,
Thank you. I
said, let's suck him in with the crime, and then they'll be hooked, and then we can go back and lead up to it.
You are a smart man.
He almost canceled the book over it. He was that upset over it.
You are a smart man. The guy who fired the first shot, or people firing any shots, even though she's running with him, no one gets concerned they might miss and hit her, or they didn't care.
No, I don't. Well, it was an impulsive act in the first place. My feeling of what happened was that Del Clement, who owned the tavern and was a drunk, he was a young rancher type, and his tavern was almost always empty because people are so scared of McElroy they wouldn't go in there. They're in the tavern drinking. I think he is drinking himself, and he says, I've had enough of this shit. Walks out the side door of the tavern, goes across the street, stands in front of his truck when McElroy walks out. It was not a planned act. I mean, that's one of the terribly, you're talking about the sympathy to the town. One of the terribly unfair things that happened was that it was portrayed as a vigilante act in the sense that it was a group decision. That's normally what vigilante implies. It wasn't. I mean, think about it. Those 45 to 50 witnesses, do you think they would have stood there and watched it if they knew what was going to happen? I mean, they had no idea what was going to happen. And I think Clement just lost it, pulled out his rifle. Another guy pulled out their 22, and they blew his head off. Just like that. It was about maybe a minute's worth of contemplation at most, from thinking about it to actually blowing his head off. I forgot what the question was. Because again, I think that just from reading it, I know it's connected that way, but you're going to get the sense, especially if someone just reads some details, that they had the meeting at the again, I want to see the movie, see how they cover this, but they have the meeting at the lodge, and they all start marching out and spreading out, and out of the west, and you get the high noon song playing, and two people either are chosen or decide on their own, break away from the pack, and actually, but that the all 40 or 30 or whoever's in that lodge, they've all got their guns and they're all coming out. So you're saying right now that's not how it happened. No, it's not true. They didn't have their guns either with them. I'm sure there were a few in the trucks, but when they went in there, they were just trying to decide what to do. And I know they didn't sit there and say, let's suck him into town and then go down and shoot him, 39 of them would have gone home and gotten on their tractors, They wouldn't have said, oh, yeah, let's do that, and I'll make myself a witness, Well, I think that was terribly unfair to the town. Well, and I think it's good. And I will certainly be sure that the way I cut this, that's very clear that again, because I think you see, when you hear vigilante, you don't, except for Charles Bronson, you don't think of a single, vigilante. It seems to be, a whole group of people, going to hit somebody, some crook or whatever. Well, listen, so let me wrap up. We can talk a bit after. This has been fascinating, but I'm going to do the podcast wrap up and allow you to do. I forget. Did you? I found you through Facebook or an email connection to the book. How did I get you? I think you went to my website.
Your website, good. So you'll give that, and obviously cover this in the new book that they can get on Amazon, and the movie. Well, we've thrown the movie in. Well, that will be part of I won't need to throw that in again. Well, this has been a fascinating hour with Harry N. MacLean, and covering his book, In Broad Daylight, A Murder in Skidmore, Missouri. Now, as Harry has mentioned, this book, and I mentioned this book was like written in the 80s, shortly after the incident, but it's been updated. And there is a newer version that can be gotten on Amazon that covers, has all the pictures and everything from the original book, but also sort of more information of how, which I found fascinating. We've covered some of it here, but obviously I want to, interest the audience into getting the book, that it also more detail of how you got involved, how you were able to get access to the folks, because again, as we've mentioned, you went down there very shortly thereafter. This wasn't years and years later. You went down
Right.
to interview people. So, Harry, tell my audience how they can learn more about you, or maybe even drop you an email.
I've got a website. It's harrymaclean.com. The only trick is it's MAC, which means that it's Scottish. If you drop the A out, you'll never find me. And there's a blog on there. It's not super active, but there's still a lot of people debating, oddly enough, debating the ethicalness of McElroy's lawyer, who kept getting him off on all these cases. That's one of the things that, that people are still on there, and the lawyer's children are now involved in this argument.
Well, that I want to look at that, and obviously you mentioned, I think at the very top, so we have to repeat it, that you are a lawyer and have lawyered, and we all think defense attorneys are evil until we need one.
Until you need one, yeah.
Until I need one, and so I'm sorry, I'm a big liberal, so I believe in constitutional rights, and I do think that the only way our system, the adversarial system, works is when you have independent defense counsel and independent prosecutors.
Well, there's just a funny, and I don't know if you want to use this, right? There's a funny little story on that. It's the people in Skidmore in that area just demonized the lawyer. They hated him because he kept getting them off, getting them off again and again and again. And until they got picked up for a DUI, and then they hired him. It's kind of funny when I found out.
So again, I want to thank Harry. It's been a fascinating time. I hope my audience will pick up the book and the new book. And I want to, are you working on anything else right now? Are you working on any books? You're an author guy?
Yeah. Let me just mention this. Your audience might find it interesting. My second book was called Once Upon a Time, A True Story of Memory, Murder, and the Law. And it involved a woman in California who claimed to recover a repressed memory of her father murdering her playmate 20 years earlier. So it was this whole repressed memory phenomena of the early 90s. And it was a great trial, fascinating trial. The book was selected as a notable book of the year by the New York Times, so forth and so forth. But the point of it is that Showtime is doing a 4-part series on the book. And it's called Memory Wars. And it's due to be out next September or October, and I'm one of the lead narrators in it.
I will be hitting you before that.
Yeah, I hope so.
So, Harry, this has been great.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been a nice, interesting conversation.
Well, and what I'll do is I'll send you the link. I mean, the link is out there. You can go look at my other stuff, and most people just go to see their own, and that's okay. I get hits.
All right, I'll put it up on my website.
And perfect. I'll give you the link. Give the links to my host page, and that way they can see everything, including that one as well. So again, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to say goodbye and thank you so much to Harry N. MacLean.
Thank you.